I think definitions of reconciliation tend to vary a bit, but my own working definition when I'm engaged in something is the transformation of violent or destructive conflict into non-violent and creative disagreement. One of the mistakes in reconciliation work is to apply a template across different conflicts, violent or non-violent. But in practice, it is very relationally based. The model we developed while I was involved in leading the CCN, or as we called it then, the International Centre for Reconciliation, ICR, was based around some words beginning with R. The first was research. So you will never understand someone else's conflict, but you need to spend time trying to find out as much as you can. Iteratively, that leads you into a relationship with the people whom you're researching. The research and the relationship have to be those of a servant, not of a master. The relationship builds and you begin to see their needs, and so you look at what are their needs of relief, of help, of support. And in every conflict, from a family to a nation, there will be needs of relief. As you go through that, you get to the point where you can begin to take far more risk in the process. So you begin to take risks in bringing people together, in putting yourself in an awkward place very often. Following the risk, that itself leads into a process of reconciliation. You begin to see people coming together, the transformation of conflict, as I said a few moments ago, from destructive and even violent into creative but still disagreement. You don't try and resolve conflict, you try and reconcile those involved in conflict. And finally, resource. And you resource those who are involved so that they themselves can sustainably maintain reconciliation and, for that matter, share it with others in other conflicts. Now, there is a whole underlying theology to that around the incarnation, the presence of Christ among us, the gift of the Holy Spirit as the resource to us, the relationships within the Trinity, God's meeting of our every need, of his lavish endowment to us, and the risk taken in Jesus' living among us and God himself becoming fully human. All of that is theologically underpinned, but that's the basic way in which I tended to work through the issues. And they're not separate steps. It's a series of spinning plates that end up, hopefully, God willing, with all six spinning at the same time. I wouldn't be quite as narrow as to say that the only way to reconciliation is through the cross. That is the definitive moment in human reconciliation with God and with each other. That's where the barriers are broken down. I think you have to say that, yes, the cross is the moment of reconciliation, the ultimate sacrifice, and that taking the cross into ourselves, the cross that so many of us bear and wear, the Coventry cross, has to be taken in and made part of our way of living. But that can only happen through incarnation, through resurrection as well. I think what stands out for me looking back in what was an extraordinarily difficult period, 2002, 2007, I think in many ways the most life-changing, the most invigorating years of my ministry, and also the most difficult and the most painful, the saddest. I think some of the work that we did in Nigeria, particularly in the plateau, where we did manage, in the grace of God, to see a conflict transformed and peace to a degree established, obviously with many other people. I think anyone who says, I did that or we did that, any organisation or individual, is just kidding themselves and is very arrogant to boot. We never do it. It is God who does it, and it's also a load of other people who do it. But we contributed there. One of my rules in reconciliation, rule of thumb, is that a week of conflict gives you a year of reconciliation work, at least, sometimes a generation. And therefore 5 years is but a blink of an eye, and there's no way that one can have accomplished much. You can move things along a bit, and that's a huge achievement. But there were many more failures than there were successes. I think personally, I colluded with and to a degree was responsible for over-fast growth, which led to significant reduction with much human cost as a result. And I blame myself for that. I think there is some practical advice, there's some spiritual advice. I think the spiritual advice is be embedded in the life of the diocese and the cathedral, and never allow the ministry of reconciliation to be as separate as it was, I think probably going a very long way back indeed, possibly to the rebuilding. Live in the koinonia, in the fellowship into which God has put us. I think there are moments when the reconciliation work has become too inward-looking, and moments when it's been excessively adventurous. Keep in touch with what God is doing. We're to listen to what's going on outside us, in the world around us, with spiritual ears, and be confident in the call of God to be a world centre of reconciliation, not a marginal player. Practically, the lesson I've learned is if you take your eyes off the money, everything else falls apart. We must be sustainable. The answer to that question, what it is always going to depend on the prejudices with which you start. I mean, because many people, for example, would say reconciliation with the environment. But I'm going to confine it to human beings. And obviously the underlying reconciliation need that is most important at any time, at all time, and has always been and always will be, is the reconciliation of the creation and especially of human beings to the Creator, to God who made us. Having said that, just so I don't get too many letters about the subject, I think I'd want to say that in day-to-day terms, for me, the threat of interfaith and religiously justified violence is for me, the big issue in human reconciliation. What is it that's causing this upsurge of violence? How do we understand it, and what are we going to do about it? How do we as Christians engage with this, not in revenge or hatred, but in the self-sacrificing love of Christ, incarnationally, in a cross-shaped way, and in a way that enables other religious traditions to find their own peace, and mainstream groups within them to find a narrative, a story that outpaces the shallow, terrifying attraction of the Kalashnikov and the Semtex. That, I think, is the great generational challenge. And the imposition of violence to stop violence will never be a definitive answer. From the moment when Bishop Colin rang up and said, I'd like to see you, and said, I want to offer you a job, you'll spend 10 days, 2 weeks, a month in areas of conflict and war zones, and we can't pay you. And my wife said, any offer that crazy has got to be God, so we better do it. Since that moment, I stumbled into something that, whether I'm good or bad at it, and I've no idea, I am utterly passionate about reconciliation. It's the desire of my heart to find ways in which we can transform destructive, violent conflict into peaceful disagreement and diversity, possibly with passion, passionate disagreement, but not destructive disagreement. I carry with me in my mind the image of Christ in glory behind the high altar at Coventry, and in my heart there is that memory of sitting in my stall at evensong on the days before I travelled to somewhere dangerous and difficult, feeling sick and frightened, and looking at the man standing between the feet of Jesus, overshadowed, unable to see the Christ who protected him. And I carry with me those extraordinary words in the great bronze letters at the back of the cathedral at the west end on the floor. On 14th November 1940, this cathedral burned to the glory of God. And that sense of what human beings can destroy, God raises up. And also the great west screen with the insanely dancing, bopping angels going completely crazy. And that sense of the figure of Christ at one end and the bopping angels at the other. And next to them, the sun bursting through the baptistry window. The darkness of the Chapel of Unity, so often reflecting the darkness and chaos of our disunity in the church, and the call to the world in the Chapel of Industry. The peace of the Chapel of the Stalingrad Madonna, my favourite place to sit and pray silently in the cathedral. And that sense of a place that knows what it's for, and provided it holds that sense, will always find itself in the centre of God's will. I was down in Burundi, in Bujumbura, and I was facilitating a 3-day conference of rebel and government, military and political leaders on reconciliation. And we worked away and worked in our groups. It's very hard work, utterly demanding. On the 3rd day, someone in one part of the room pointed across the room and pointed to a man and said, "That man in the war led a militia that killed 30,000 people. How can I be reconciled to him?" He was a very senior officer. And I remember looking out of the window while trying to think what to say across Lake Tanganyika, and pointing out at the lake and saying to him, "If you go out in a boat on the lake and you fall out of the boat, what do you do?" And he said, "Well, I swim." And I said, "If you don't swim, what happens?" He said, "Well, I drown." And I said, "Well, if you don't reconcile, you will slaughter each other." They wanted me to give a solution to reconciliation. And the whole point of that story is reconciliation is done by the people in conflict. What we do in Coventry or anywhere else, what we try and do here, is to make it easier for people to find their own way to reconciliation. There has to be that servant side, but there also has to be that bluntness and toughness about the consequences of non-reconciliation. This is not a luxury option to fit on top of the gospel. It is the sine qua non of the gospel itself. It is utterly relevant because it is the narrative, the testimony to God's extraordinary work. And when told with realism that there were still people who remembered the bombing when I was a canon there, and who still hated the Germans, and I understand where they came from on that. I'm not judging them, who lost friends and family. Coventry springs out of that prophetic moment of Father, forgive. When that story is told, and is told by people bearing this cross of nails, who demonstrate that that still is alive in them. I've seen in parts of Africa people so transformed that the tears ran down their cheeks when they heard that story, because it told them it was possible to change. Part of it is getting people to pray for you. Part of it is getting them to recognize the conflicts in their own situations and seeing the need for it. And part of them is hearing accessible stories about how reconciliation transforms communities. Get people involved in that, and they'll begin to see what you're doing, and it spreads round.
All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. The hatred which divides nation from nation, race from race, class from class.
Father, forgive the covetous desires of people and nations to possess what is not their own.
Father, forgive the greed that exploits the work of human hands and lays waste the earth.
Father, forgive our envy of the welfare and happiness of others.
Father, forgive our indifference to the plight of the imprisoned, the homeless, the refugee.
Father, forgive the lust which dishonours the bodies of men, women and children.
Father, forgive the pride which leads us to trust in ourselves and not in God.
Father, forgive. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as Christ forgave you. Amen.
Amen.